Chapter 9 Preflight and Postflight Procedures Introduction Ground operations, inspections, and checks must be accomplished prior, during, and at the completion of any flight. Procedures for accomplishing many of these tasks have been developed by the manufacturer and are contained in the Rotorcraft Flight Manual, RFM, or Pilot's Operating Handbook, POH. Checklists. It is essential that the student understand that the purpose of the checklist is not to provide a comprehensive procedure, but rather to provide a systematic, sequential directory of those tasks to be accomplished for the safe operation of the helicopter. The student should be shown that the checklist is derived from those procedures found in the applicable RFM/PO. Figure 9.1. It cannot be stressed enough that the use of the checklist ensures that items necessary for safe operation are not overlooked or forgotten. Checklists are of no value if the pilot is not committed to their use. Instructor fundamentals, such as the law of primacy, play a very important role in helping the student develop routine use of checklists. While maintaining a positive attitude, discuss the use of checklists with the student. Demonstration and meaningful repetition establish positive habit patterns that the student will carry forward in all aviation applications. Also, demonstrate techniques that reinforce good practices. Turning the blades to a 90 degrees position during pre-flight or prior to start, although not necessarily listed as a step for some checklists, ensures the blades are untied and also allows for checking correlation of flight control movement. As an instructor, use personal experiences to demonstrate why steps are performed. Perhaps, while conducting a pre-flight check of a fuel sample, it was learned that the sample contained water or contaminants. This example reaffirms the student's need for checklist use. Illustrate situations where failure to follow checklist procedures may lead to catastrophic consequences, such as leaving the blades tied down during start, covers left on the aircraft during start, failure to place switches in the required position, failure to remove mooring equipment, and failure to conduct power checks before takeoff. Each of these examples and the resulting hazards can be discussed, showing the impact of not using the checklist or lack of understanding for that particular step. At a minimum, a well-designed checklist should encompass the following phases of flight: pre-flight inspection, before engine start, before taxi, before takeoff, after takeoff, cruise descent, before landing, after landing, engine shutdown, and securing required documents. Emphasize to the student that a safe flight begins with a careful inspection of the helicopter. The purpose of the pre-flight inspection is twofold: determine if the helicopter is legally airworthy, and determine if the helicopter is in condition for safe flight. The airworthiness is determined, in part, by the certificates and documents that must be on board the helicopter during operation. Figure 9.2. Educate the student on potential liabilities and subsequent ramifications of not having verified these documents. An excellent reference publication for a student pilot is the Plain Sense Handbook. This publication explains the fundamental information on the requirements of owning, operating, and maintaining a private aircraft. Show the student each of the following documents and discuss where they can be found and what purpose they serve: airworthiness certificate, registration number, manufacturer, serial number, category, etc., registration certificate, eligibility, application requirements, expiration date, etc., Federal Communications Commission, FCC, radio station license, if required by the type of transmitters on board. Refer to Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 47 CFR, Part 87.18, Operation Limitations, which may be in the form of a Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, approved RFM and/or PO placards, instrument markings, or any combination thereof, helicopter logbooks and inspection records. It is imperative to take the time to discuss what maintenance inspections entail and, when listed as required or if installed, that the student understands the applicability of those statements. Explain calendar inspections versus hourly inspections. If an inspection has both calendar and hourly criteria, clarify which criteria has precedence. While the intent is not to produce an airframe and power plant, A&P mechanic, a pilot should demonstrate basic aviation maintenance knowledge. Further information regarding required documentation and inspections can be found in Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 14 CFR, Part 91. Pre-flight inspection. Pre-flight inspections should only be accomplished after the instructor has conducted a thorough pre-flight briefing with the student, which should be done in a place free of distractions to maximize learning and retention. If the student has not been told exactly what to expect step by step of the pre-flight inspection, they will probably be overwhelmed by the observations and information presented to them when conducting the inspection. A good initial pre-flight in a hangar is preferable to one that is conducted on the flight line. If a similar helicopter is disassembled for maintenance, this could serve as a good training aid and allow the student to see the actual part or piece of the helicopter that they may not be able to see during an actual pre-flight. The pre-flight inspection should be performed in accordance with the printed checklist provided by the manufacturer for the specific make and model helicopter. Emphasize that the pre-flight inspection of the helicopter begins while approaching the helicopter on the ramp. Tell the student to note the general appearance of the helicopter, looking for obvious discrepancies, such as a landing gear out of alignment, structural distortion, skin damage, and dripping fuel or oil leaks. Once at the helicopter, inspection items should be followed in the order delineated in the checklist. Caution the student to be careful when pre-flighting components and to be aware of safety wire and cotter pins which can cause cuts and puncture wounds. Particular attention should be paid to the fuel quantity, type and grade, and quality. Ensuring freedom of movement of the flight controls prior to flight is essential to safety. Instruct the student not only to physically check for freedom of movement, but also to visually check and ensure there is nothing that could fall and wedge against a control linkage and restrict movement. Explain to the student that the helicopter should have the required equipment for the type of flight to be flown. Required equipment can be found in 14 CFR Section 91.205. Refer the student to 14 CFR Section 91.213 regarding the minimum equipment list, MEL, for the helicopter. Discuss the purpose of the MEL, what items may be on the list, and the applicable limitations for instruments and equipment. Cockpit management. While discussing cockpit management, it is important for the student to understand that aircraft control is always the first priority. In doing so, continue to instruct the basics of cockpit management. Ensure the student has all required equipment, documents, checklists, performance data, and navigation charts for the flight. Show the student how to organize these items to ensure they remain secured throughout the flight, as well as in the order of use. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of kneeboards and other document retention devices. It is important for the instructor to note that the physical placement of such items can impact the student's flight dexterity or control. For example, a kneeboard on the right leg may interfere with the student's right hand and cyclic grip, on the left leg it may interfere with the collective. Some document collection devices are bulky and may become hazardous if not properly stowed and/or secured. Another concern is operations with the doors removed, a luxury of helicopter flight that can potentially turn into a hazard. Secure all items before starting engines. If a portable intercom, headset, or a handheld global positioning system, GPS, is used, ensure that the routing of wires and cables does not interfere with the operation of flight controls. The pilot must retain the necessary freedom of movement to reach for radios, etc. Emphasis should be placed on the necessity for a pilot to be thoroughly familiar with all aircraft systems, switch functions, switch locations, and control functions, particularly for night operations. This is especially critical in helicopters because the pilot normally has both hands and both feet engaged in controlling the helicopter. Discuss procedures for applying friction to the controls to allow changing radio frequencies and other functions that require removing a hand from a flight control. In a static aircraft, have the student conduct a dry run of sequencing through the material he or she has organized. This can be incorporated into practical lessons involving before engine start, before taxiing, and hover checks. Have the student conduct mock radio calls and performance planning checks. All these tasks require organizational forethought of needed items, checklists, and publications. This ground instruction of cockpit management allows the student to focus on controlling the aircraft in flight rather than diverting attention to organizing in flight. Once training has progressed to in-flight tasks, stress the importance of when and where to make calls and when and where to change frequencies, always focusing on controlling the aircraft first.
Give situational examples, such as, do not wait until after you have entered Class B, C, or D airspace to organize the required publications, maps, checklists, and radio frequencies.
The student should strive to think several minutes ahead of the aircraft. During flight training, there must always be a clear understanding between the student and flight instructor of who has control of the aircraft. Prior to any dual training flight, a briefing should be conducted that includes the procedure for the exchange of flight controls. The following 3-step process for the exchange of flight controls is highly recommended. When a flight instructor wishes the student to take control of the aircraft, he or she should say to the student, "You have the flight controls." The student should acknowledge immediately by saying, "I have the flight controls." The flight instructor confirms by again saying, "You have the flight controls." Only when the other pilot has confirmed he or she has the controls, will you relinquish the controls. Figure 9.3. Part of the procedure should be a visual check to ensure the other person actually has the flight controls. When returning the controls to the flight instructor, the student should follow the same procedure the instructor used when giving control to the student. The student should stay on the controls until the instructor says, "I have the flight controls." There should never be any doubt as to who is flying the helicopter at any time. Numerous accidents have occurred due to a lack of communication or a misunderstanding about who actually had control of the aircraft, particularly between student and flight instructor. It is imperative that the student understands that the term flight controls is used in this procedure. A common point of confusion occurs when the pilot not flying announces a hazard to flight. For example, "I have the traffic," is construed to mean, "I have the traffic and the controls." The pilot flying the aircraft relinquishes the flight controls, misunderstanding the statement, and now is probably focused outside, looking for the traffic. At this point, no one is flying the aircraft. Establishing the above three-step process during initial training ensures the formation of a very beneficial habit pattern. Ground operations instructors should describe in detail the process for ground handling and movement of helicopters on the ground in preparation for flight. Show the student where the manufacturer's recommended procedures for ground handling are found in the RFM. This discussion should include removal from typical storage locations, such as trailers and hangars, towing options, taxiing options, and choice of a launch area. The rotor downwash from a helicopter can cause considerable damage to persons, property, and other aircraft. Ensure the student understands the importance of coordinating with all interested parties, including airport management, landowners, and other aircraft operators prior to conducting helicopter operations. It is important a student understands the importance of operating a helicopter safely on the ground. This includes being familiar with standard hand signals that are used by ramp personnel and traffic control light signals from the control tower. Figures 9-4 and 9-5, instructors should direct the student to the AIM for more information on hand signals and task the student to practice proper hand signals with another student. Hands-on experience and practice better reinforces the material and increases retention. To familiarize the student with control light signals from the control tower, the instructor can request the different signals from the tower over the radio so the student can see the real light signals. Tower windows are often tinted, which causes light colors to appear a slightly different color. As the student progresses, ask the student what signal to expect and arrange with the tower to delay the light signal some time after the radio transmission to allow the student to respond to the instructor. The pilot needs to brief passengers and ground personnel. In addition to the required information in the regulations, the student should learn to tell ground personnel where the helicopter would go in case of malfunction, always to approach from a forward side of the helicopter, and approach only after acknowledgement by the pilot. Many rotors can dip to as low as 4 feet off the surface. Usually, the forward portion of the main rotor dips the lowest to the ground, so approaching from the very front of the helicopter is usually not a safe route. Pilots should be taught to teach personnel never to come to the rear of a helicopter, except in the case of the BV-234 KV-107 to which rear access is safer. Special precautions must be taught for the BO-105 and BK-117 due to their rear access. Tail rotors have killed and injured as many people as airplane propellers. Students should learn to keep their hands, arms, and hats down, and to be careful of long poles, tripods, survey targets, antennas, etc. No one should ever chase a hat that is blown away. It is safest to stay in the helicopter until the blades stop or stand by the operations area until the blades stop, but often impractical due to other constraints. By the same token, the pilot should ensure that passengers are briefed to stay inside the airframe until the blades stop in the unlikely case that an unplanned event occurs. Unlike airplanes, it is quite common for a passenger to be sitting in the front seat and be able to place a camera or other type obstruction around the collective, even when the dual controls are removed. The pilot should always ensure that any doors are closed and completely latched. Accidents have occurred when objects fell out of aft cabins or cargo bays and struck tail rotors. If the helicopter is being flown with doors removed, this precaution is especially necessary. Engine start. Discuss in detail the process of engine starting in initial operation. Stress the importance of using the engine start procedure recommended by the manufacturer in the RFM. Emphasize the hazards associated with engine start and blade rotation or rotor engagement. Take time to show the student the reason for certain steps, such as electrical sequencing or throttle positioning. Most helicopters have steps in place to prevent possible damage to electrical systems or to prevent inadvertent fuel flow to the engine. Spend time with the student, enhancing his or her knowledge of these systems through explanation of these steps. Unlike a fixed-wing aircraft, the helicopter has a 360 degrees hazard area due to the main and tail rotors. Remember, it takes many flight hours and years of aviation exposure for the student to learn what an instructor already knows. Some things are learned from observation. As an instructor, take the time to demonstrate the flexibility of the main rotor and the minimum height it may droop. Also, use this opportunity to discuss approaching a running helicopter, the dangers of a drooping main rotor, and the effects of sloping or rising terrain. When possible, Show the student the invisible tail rotor in operation. The high RPM of the tail rotor makes it virtually invisible to those unaware of its hazard. Explain to the student that, whenever possible, the pilot must attempt to park the helicopter so the tail rotor is away from the most common access path to and from the helicopter. In addition to the invisible aspect of the tail rotor, the student should be advised to remember the tail rotor intake side, typically on the right side, does not warn the person by blowing wind in their face or make as much noise as the thrusting side of the tail rotor. Prior to engine start, and while the student is sitting in the cockpit, have him or her look 90 degrees to both sides and point out the distances needed for the helicopter to clear objects. Reinforce the clearances and visual appearances needed for safe flight along with the limited field of view from the cockpit. Ensure the student understands engine overspeed or hot start procedures prior to engine start. Prior to engaging the starter or rotor system, caution the student to ensure the helicopter is cleared 360 degrees, a call out of clear is made, a response has been made from anyone who might be near the helicopter after starting procedures. Conduct a thorough discussion and demonstration of operational checks in accordance with the checklist. Figure 9.6. Taxiing instructors should place emphasis on the fact that a pilot should look outside the helicopter to the sides, as well as to the front, anytime the helicopter is moving under its own power on the surface. The student must be aware of the entire area around the helicopter to ensure it remains well clear of all obstructions and other aircraft. Explain the effects of wind on power requirements and the tail rotor, and include a discussion of loss of tail rotor effectiveness, LTE. Students should be thoroughly familiar with the terms taxi, hover taxi, and air taxi. A helicopter's unique abilities allow the pilot flexibility in maneuvering the helicopter. Do not allow that flexibility to lead to poor judgment. Think ahead of the helicopter movement. For example, if there are strong winds, it would be a good time for the instructor to instill the future planning requirements by asking the student where the tail rotor is and what the effects of the strong winds are. Another example is system malfunction. Instructors should constantly be asking the student, what would you do if the system malfunctioned right now? Talking through these types of scenarios and emergencies helps the student prepare for an actual situation by rehearsing reactions, which could save a life. If in a controlled airspace environment, ensure the student pilot understands the taxi instructions prior to acknowledging them. Too frequently, pilots acknowledge instructions without fully understanding those instructions, potentially leading to confusion and/or mishaps. Additional information related to taxiing helicopters can be found in the Helicopter Flying Handbook, Chapter 10, Basic Maneuvers, and the Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, Chapter 4, Aerodynamics. Before takeoff, explain to the student that the before takeoff check is a systematic procedure for making a check of the engine, controls, systems, instruments, and avionics prior to flight. Figure 9.7. It is normally performed before taxiing to a position near the takeoff point. Emphasize that while performing the before takeoff check, the student divides his or her attention between the inside and outside of the helicopter. It is at this point that the instructor can determine if the student has retained any discussion in cockpit management. Does the student have a plan for the many actions required while conducting the before takeoff checks? Remind the student that each helicopter has different features and equipment, which is why the takeoff checklist provided by the manufacturer or operator is used to perform the checks. After landing, impress upon the student that after landing checks, if required by the RFM, should be completed using the manufacturer's established procedures. Movement of the helicopter to the parking area is accomplished according to instructions received from the tower or ground control. Remind the student that, at uncontrolled landing areas, it is the pilot's responsibility to ensure the helicopter does not present a safety hazard to persons or property on the ground. Helicopter pilots must always be aware of the extent of damage that the rotor wash can cause if aircraft and property are not secured properly. If the pilot is ever in doubt, request an alternate route or detour around the airfield if there appears to be loose items that will be affected by the rotor wash. Parking. Advise the student that whenever possible, the helicopter should be parked 90 degrees from the actual or forecast winds. Ensure the student understands that exceptions may be necessary under strong wind conditions. Particular attention must be observed to avoid potential damage to the rotor head and/or tail boom. If possible, demonstrate alternate options. Unless parking in a designated, supervised area, the student should be instructed to select a location and heading that prevents the propeller or jet blast of other airplanes from striking the helicopter broadside. Do not allow the student to become complacent. The flight is not complete until completion of all tasks and the pilot is walking away from the aircraft. Engine shutdown. It is essential to stress the importance of following the checklist during engine shutdown. As the training flight nears completion, it is human nature to relax, becoming inattentive. The instructor must take time to go through the shutdown with the student, noting reasons for certain steps. For example, depending on the type of engine, reciprocating or turbine, different cool-down periods are necessary to prevent material damage to the internal components. What is learned first is most often retained. Educate the student on the specifics and purpose of steps pertaining to the power plant in use. Additionally, certain steps are performed to identify possible system faults. For instance, if the helicopter uses a step to check battery voltage, explain why the check is performed. Another very common cooling time check is to turn off the fuel boost pumps and ensure the engine keeps running. A line leak or faulty component will kill the engine then, requiring repair prior to the next flight. The student should not be allowed to conduct shutdown procedures from memory. Post-flight point out that a flight is never complete until the engine is shut down, rotors have stopped, and the helicopter is secured. When the rotors have stopped, the pilot then carries out a post-flight inspection to include checking the general condition of the aircraft. Stress to the student that the post-flight procedure is an essential part of any flight. Although not meant to be a thorough inspection, the post-flight is no less important. Discrepancies noted on post-flight allow maintenance personnel more time to make appropriate repairs and prepare the aircraft for subsequent flights. Using experience, point out common or frequent trends found during post-flight. Ask the student or have the student question what he or she may see. Are the fluid levels within limits? Are they at the same level as checked on pre-flight? Point out the concern over possible foreign object damage, FOD, specifically on the main and tail rotor blades and undercarriage. Observe any fluid or debris on the engine or transmission decks. Are fluids present on the ground or along the fuselage? Show the student how to make appropriate entries in the aircraft logbook. Explain how vague entries cause confusion and to be descriptive in noting discrepancies. Also, discuss what policies or duties may be the pilot's responsibility, such as cleaning the cockpit area or windows. Demonstrate the correct method and materials to be used, if applicable. Securing and servicing. When a flight is completed, the aircraft should be hangared or tied down and the rotor blades secured. Tying the blades down in the same manner each time instills positive habit transfer and awareness of tie down and cover stowage and location. Ensure that the battery is off and have the student note the fuel level at the completion of the flight and ensure refuel is accomplished if necessary. Refer the student to the RFM for the procedures used to service and secure the helicopter. Instructor tip: remember, instructors are role models for student pilots. Make the use of checklists meaningful to the student by demonstrating the importance and reasons for each step. By using checklists on a regular basis, the instructor's actions underscore the importance of relying on checklists rather than memory. Figure 9.8, Chapter Summary. This chapter describes those flight preparations and ground procedures normally associated with helicopter flight. In this discussion, particular emphasis was placed on the use of the manufacturer's procedures and checklists in accomplishing various functions. For additional information in any of these areas, refer to the RFM for the helicopter being flown.